April 18, 1943, 7:35 a.m. Bougainville Island. The jungle canopy trembled beneath the roar of twin engines. Two Mitsubishi G4M bombers, their green paint dulled by salt and humidity, cut through the morning sky above the Solomon Sea. Inside the lead aircraft, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat with his hands folded across his lap, his eyes closed in contemplation. The architect of Pearl Harbor was traveling to inspect frontline troops, to deliver words of encouragement to men who had begun to taste the bitterness of retreat. The flight path had been meticulously planned, transmitted in code, scheduled to the minute. Yamamoto's staff had assured him the Americans could not reach this far. Not here. Not into the heart of Japanese-held territory, 1,500 miles from their nearest base. The distance itself was a fortress, 6 miles above and 35 miles away, 18 Lockheed P-38. Lightnings sliced through the same sky, their twin booms cutting contrails into the tropical air. The pilots had been flying for over 3 hours, skimming 50 feet above the waves to avoid radar detection, their fuel gauges sinking toward the red. They had launched before dawn from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, their mission orders precise and unprecedented. Intercept Admiral Yamamoto. Kill him, return if possible. The young men in those cockpits, boys from Iowa and Texas and California, carried with them something more than bullets and fuel. They carried the full technological and industrial weight of a nation that had learned to project death across distances that defied imagination. This was not merely an ambush. This was a statement written in altitude and gasoline and machine gun fire, that nowhere was safe, that no ocean was wide enough, that American power could reach across the curvature of the Earth itself to settle accounts. To understand the shock that would ripple through the Japanese command in the minutes to come, one must first understand what they believed about distance, about logistics, about the fundamental limitations of air warfare in 1943. The Pacific Theater was not like Europe, where air bases sat mere minutes apart, where bombers could strike and return before their coffee cooled. The Pacific was an empire of emptiness, thousands of miles of open water punctuated by specks of coral and volcanic rock. Air power here was constrained by mathematics as much as by courage, by fuel capacity, by engine endurance, by the cruel calculus of weight versus range. The Japanese Zero, that elegant predator of the early war, could fly nearly 2,000 miles on internal fuel, but only because it sacrificed armor, self-sealing tanks, and pilot protection. It was a philosophy-made airframe. Reach far, strike hard, accept casualties. American doctrine had evolved differently. American pilots flew aircraft laden with armor plating, with redundant systems, with radios that worked, and oxygen systems that didn't fail at altitude. They flew heavier, slower, safer, and until 1943, shorter. The P-38 Lightning changed that equation. With twin Allison engines mounted on those distinctive booms, with a central nacelle housing the pilot and a cluster of 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, the Lightning was a brute, an ungainly, powerful machine that could carry fuel in wingtip tanks and still outrun a Zero in level flight. Its range, when fitted with external tanks, exceeded 2,000 miles. It could fly from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, loiter for combat, and return, barely, on paper. But paper was a clean, theoretical place. The real Pacific was a realm of failed engines, of navigation errors over featureless ocean, of fuel gauges that lied and compasses that wandered. Yamamoto's staff knew this. They had calculated the risks and found them acceptable. The Americans, they believed, would not dare such a mission, could not sustain it. The logistics were suicidal. They were wrong. The decision to kill Yamamoto had been made at the highest levels of American command, a choice debated in rooms where the weight of moral consequence pressed against the walls. Yamamoto was not merely a military officer. He was a symbol, the brain behind the surprise attack that had dragged America into war. Intelligence intercepts, decoded through the secret triumph of American cryptanalysis, had revealed his travel itinerary with stunning precision. Date, time, route, altitude. Everything needed to position an execution squad in the sky. Some officers hesitated. Assassination of a military commander was legal under the laws of war, but it was also a revelation of intelligence capabilities. If the mission succeeded, the Japanese might realize their codes were compromised. If it failed, 18 P-38s and their pilots would be lost for nothing. The debate swirled through the command chain until it reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, and then Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, and ultimately President Franklin Roosevelt himself. The decision came back swift and cold. Do it. 18 P-38s were chosen. 16 would fly high cover, ready to engage the escorting Zeros. 4 would drop low for the kill. Leading the killer flight was Major John W. Mitchell, a 34-year-old veteran whose navigation skills had earned him the grim honor of shepherding this mission across 500 miles of empty ocean with no margin for error. Flying his wing was Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr., a man whose competitive fire burned hot enough to melt caution. Beside them flew Lieutenant Rex T. Barber and Lieutenant Jim McClanahan, young men who had learned to fly in peacetime and learned to kill in the skies above Guadalcanal. They launched in darkness, engines coughing blue flame, fuel tanks pregnant with volatile gasoline. The external drop tanks hung beneath each wing like tumors, ugly and essential. The pilots flew in radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning and Mitchell's iron concentration. Their formations tight, their altitude murderous, 50 feet above the waves, low enough to taste salt spray, low enough that a moment's inattention would drive them into the sea. For 3 hours and 15 minutes, they flew, muscles cramped, necks aching, fuel burning at a rate that left no room for error. And then, exactly where and when intelligence had promised, the bombers appeared. The Japanese pilots escorting Yamamoto's flight had expected nothing. They flew lazy patterns above the 2 G-4M bombers, scanning a sky they believed to be empty of enemies. The nearest American fighters were at Guadalcanal, hours away. The war had taught them that Americans were brave, reckless even, but not suicidal. The distance was simply too great. Then the P-38s rose from the jungle canopy like avenging angels, throttles screaming, guns already traversing toward target. The Zero pilots reacted with the trained violence of combat veterans, rolling into intercepts, but they were outnumbered and caught low, their altitude advantage stolen. Above, the 16 P-38s of the high cover dove into the Zeros, a brawl erupting at 3,000 feet, tracers stitching bright lines through tropical air. Below, Lanphier and Barber closed on the bombers. Yamamoto's pilot, realizing the trap, shoved his throttles forward and dove toward the jungle, trying to use the trees as cover, trying to outrun the inevitable. It was futile. The P-38 was faster, its engines howling as Lanphier closed the distance, his gun sight centered on the bomber's fuselage. At 200 yards, he pressed the trigger. The lightning shuddered as all 5 guns opened fire simultaneously. A river of lead and high explosive pouring into the G-4M's wing root and fuselage. The bomber staggered, trailing smoke, its right engine erupting into flame. Barber, coming in from a different angle, fired a long burst into the second bomber, seeing his rounds walk across the cockpit and wing. Both bombers were dying now, falling toward the jungle in flames, their pilots fighting controls that no longer answered. Yamamoto's aircraft hit the trees and exploded in a fireball that sent black smoke boiling into the sky. The second bomber crashed into the ocean, disintegrating on impact.